Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I am Vinay Suram, your host for the webinar today. I work as a teacher educator at Azim Premji Foundation, and I'm a part of the editorial committee of I Wonder. For those of you joining us for the first time, I Wonder is an Azim Premji University publication for middle school science teachers. The magazine is available free of cost in English, Hindi, and Kannada. Our discussion today will be around the article titled Relating to Biodiversity Through Food. This is from our June 2022 issue. So, joining us in this discussion is the author of the article, Radha Gopalan. Radha is an environmental scientist with a PhD from IIT Bombay. She taught an environmental science at the Rishi Valley Education Center, Andhra Pradesh. She is also a visiting faculty at the School of Development, Azim Premji University, Bengaluru. She is also one of the editors of I Wonder and a member of the Kudali Intergenerational Learning Center, Telangana. Radha, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Vinay. Thank you for having me here.
So, before we start, let me give our audience a brief overview of the format of today's discussion. I will start the discussion with Radha. Those of you who have joined us live today may have some questions for her. Please type your questions in the chat box. I will try to weave your questions into our conversation. Radha, you engage grade 8 students from a Jilla Parishad school in a short project to document and present what they eat and the many diverse living interactions as micro, plant, animal, and human interactions that produce and shape it. Why were the students asked to gather seeds for the exhibition specifically? And why not to procure commercial seeds?
That's a great question. Thanks, Vinay. See, one of the things about seeds, at one level, at a very philosophical level, I would say seeds really hold life, right? And at another level, when you're talking about a farming community, right? Seeds are so important because seeds are saved, seeds are exchanged, and that is really what is at the heart of the food system, right? And for all of us, right? And also, if you were to expand it, to a larger sort of a canvas, when if you're able to save seeds, if you're able to understand the potential of seeds, you have you have I don't know, I think control is the wrong word to use, but you really hold your food system. Okay. But from a practical perspective as well, for an exhibition, gathering seeds is really an interesting way for students to display it also, right? And also, the other option is to have plants, and then you have to maintain the plants for the duration of the exhibition, etc. And seeds are so much easier to collect. And also, the other thing about seeds is that these families are saving these seeds, right? They have the seeds at home. And seeds give you such a beautiful display of diversity, particularly when you're looking at communities like this. The other question that you were asking was why not procure commercial seeds, right? So, the commercial seeds that are used by this community, right? They are not used to grow their traditional food. They are not used to grow food that they consume. The seeds that are bought from the market are usually grown for the market, meaning that, for instance, if they're looking at, say, they're growing tomatoes, or they're growing cauliflower, or they're growing carrots or radish, right? Those are all grown specifically for the market. That's not consumed locally in the homes. Okay. So therefore, when we were talking about procuring commercial seeds, that was one of the things, right? And here, I found something really interesting because in grade 5 EVS, right, there's a very, very interesting story about that a bajra seed that's telling its own story. And, quite an interesting and deep concept was discussed even in grade 5 in the NCERT textbook, which is about the importance of saving seeds. And that when you save your own seeds, right, you don't you don't have to pay money to buy these seeds from the market. These are your own seeds. So the input that the farmer puts in for growing for agriculture these are seeds that you have. You don't have to buy from the market. So there are many reasons why we thought about it, but these are some connections I thought which might be interesting when you think about seeds. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. So Vinay, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, there was a slight network issue there.
No problem. No
Yeah.
problem.
So one of the things that I liked was that the students were encouraged to gather information about each seat through conversations with their families and elders in the community. So
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
were they asked to do that?
Okay. So again, one can look at this in multiple layers. See, the community holds so much information. Okay, because one thing is that the elders in the family or the parents or the grandparents and the children themselves actually also know how to collect these seeds, how to actually gather the seeds, how to store them, how to at what time of the year to plant them, how to take care of them. Now I'll give you a very simple example. Simple information, like say for instance, certain seeds have to be stored, sort of smeared with ash and stored, right? Certain other seeds have to be stored in a terracotta pot. So there are various ways by which seeds have to be stored. Similarly, cultivation practices for each seed, when they should be sown, how deep they should. So there is all of this information which rests in the community, right? Now, this is not information that comes out of a textbook, right? The other thing also, when you're talking to why we encourage children to get their information from their families was because you learn so much more around this act of growing food. You also learn about changes that the elders have seen, because when you ask a question like this to an elder in the family or in the community, you hear stories,
True.
and so you get very rich information, not just about what is the seed useful for, how is it grown, etc. It's not that kind of thing. You're going to get history, you're going to get culture, you're going to get issues about health, why you should eat what, when, etc., etc. So we thought it would be a much richer way of understanding biodiversity, and that's why we
Yeah.
asked them. Yeah, 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 yeah.
I guess it's a lived experience too.
Yeah, yeah, very true, very true, very true. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Did you share any guidance with the students on what information to collect or how to document it?
Yeah, that's a tricky one actually, because unless you actually give some guidance, collecting this information can also be overwhelming, right? So what we wanted to do was, we thought together with the teachers, we said the information needs to be collected for the exhibition, but at the same time, you don't want to structure it in such a way that it becomes like a question answer session. You want to get the rich information out of the community, but you also don't want it to be like a formal interview. Okay, but we sort of shared a few questions. For instance, we asked the students to talk to their grandparents and parents and find out the practices, as in how is the seed stored, when is it, the seasonality, all of that. But in addition to that, we also told them to listen very carefully without interrupting when the elders are talking, because there is a lot of serendipitous information that comes in. When it is a conversation, you hear stories, and stories are so important for you to relate to. And food is such an emotional experience, food is a cultural experience. So when you begin to talk about something like seeds in a farming community, which grows its own food as well, so some guidance was provided, but we also told the children not to do this like an interview. That was an important thing. No, that was one important thing. Yeah, but also told them that they have to document everything and not rely on memory, but document as much as they can. Yes, yes, and they took their notebooks and pencils and pens. Yeah, yeah, they did that. Yes, 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 yes.
So, as the
Yeah.
students collected and created their seed exhibits, They looked at what their peers have brought and discussed what they have learned with their teachers. You
Yeah.
share that the teachers were they were not only amazed by the richness of the knowledge in the community, but also how easily the students related to it. I mean, why were the students able to relate it to it so easily? And what pedagogical implications does this have?
So, one thing is that often, particularly children from, and this has been, our experience a lot of times, and you probably have experienced this as well, is that often in communities where, say, these children may be the first generation learners or the second generation learners even, school, what they study in school is privileged over what you know at home, right? So in this case, children were not collecting this information from reading a textbook or from a teacher or from some other authority who was considered knowledgeable, but this was their own information. This was what they knew, what they had lived with, what they had practiced, right? And I think the beauty of it was, later we'll talk about that, is that what you have experienced, you've known the seed, you know when to grow it, you know how to grow it, you know how to harvest it, you know how to collect it, all of that, so it is your own experience, it's your own life that you are actually documenting at one level. And so it was not difficult for them to relate to it at all. And when you ask about the pedagogical implication, I think, when you learn from experience, you arrive at the concept, at the science concept, underlying science concept, but through the doing. Arthur Eisencraft, the educator, when he talks about science education, he always says activity before concept, concept before vocabulary, right? He says that. And I think if one was to think of it in this context, it is that experience that which using that and relating to that, they arrive. So it embeds itself, the understanding that you get, from a learning process, from the process of learning, and for teachers as well, to know that when children learn from their own experience or from doing, the understanding is deeper, and then it's not a question of recollecting and remembering, but it comes from an understanding. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah. Let's discuss it in a bit more detail.
Yeah.
So, typically, one aspect of science learning is to build new understanding from what students have learned before. Now, could you please give us a few more examples of these kind of connections that your students were able to see between the exercise that they have done and the concepts that they have encountered in previous grades or topics or classes?
Yeah. So this was grade 8 students, right? So if we were to go, say, downstream, okay, if we were to look at upstream and downstream, so if you're looking at, say, grade 5, 6, 7 to 8, and then within 8 itself. So, for instance, in the NCRT curriculum itself, you see that in grade 6, there is a lot about food that is discussed, actually. There's this whole section on where they talk about healthy and mindful eating, right? So children, at an earlier stage, they do meet food in terms of health, and also in their both in their social studies curriculum, as well as, whether it's in EVS or social studies or science. They also learn about that Indian traditional food is very diverse across the country. It's very diverse. You have different foods from different regions, etc. But here, what is very interesting is that within a village, okay, and I mean within a panchayat, okay, we're talking about children coming from 8 villages, okay. The furthest village is about 4 kilometers away from the school, okay.
Okay.
So now you're saying that those some of the children from those villages who come 4 kilometers away, their food or what they grow, their traditional food, is different from the ones in the plains. So there's diversity right there, you see, in the traditional food, right? So that understanding of diversity, right, of diversity, that comes there itself. So even within a small geographical area, you see, this is absolutely fascinating. The other thing that is also very interesting, and I think that also brings about a connection with what students learn earlier on, both in EVS as well as in grade 6, is this, and increasingly we are seeing this, right, in our country as well, about the role of millets, right? About millets being, very healthy. But it's not just about millets, what they do for your health. But if we also understand millets in little more detail, they are rain-fed crops. The Deccan Plateau is where millets grow very well. But and the beauty of millets, and in Telugu also they call it the miracle grain, because it can grow in extremely marginalized soils. It's rain fed, so doesn't need to be formally irrigated like say rice and wheat have to be. And the other thing about millets is, although they are rain-fed crops, and one thinks of them, growing in drought-prone areas, etc. But you can find them in Uttarakhand, you can find them in Kerala. They grow in parts of Tamil Nadu. So they grow in various geographical, ecological, soil conditions, water availability. And there's another thing about millets, they give you a sense of abundance from scarcity. You see, because they need such little resources, right? Even from an ecological perspective, right? It makes complete sense to grow millets. So, you're sort of getting children to understand that something that they studied in an earlier grade, right? How does it connect to what is happening in the context of the kind of project that we were doing, right? There's another element to this as well, and I just want to add this in here to show to sort of, it's an interesting connection, because this grade 8 class that we worked with, we'd worked with them earlier in the term, actually when they were in 7th, I think, if I'm not mistaken. We had worked with them on a project called Where Does My Food Come From?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, and in that we had also talked about millets, okay? And then when we talked about where does my food come from, we had also talked about the cultivation of millets, and simple, and also for, then once they came to grade 8, right? And we started looking at crop production, how the various practices of growing different kinds of crops, irrigation requiring crops, green revolution crops versus the traditional crops that were grown in that area. When we started talking about all of that, we also looked at the different practices of how seeding is done, right? So, for instance, millets are, some of the millet seeds are sown at the surface of the soil, some have to be sown at a greater depth. So, these kind of nuanced information as to, why should these seeds be sown here? Why not deeper? What happens, like for instance, is there enough space for their roots to grow? If they are and these are all grasses, so fibrous roots, right? So you understand all of that information as well. And because we were looking at crop production, and pretty much all over India, post Green Revolution, increasingly the role of animals in agriculture, the role of agricultural implements, the kind of the technology in agriculture has changed, right? So when we are discussing topics like this, it's also very interesting for children to see how this is practiced in a traditional system. So, for instance, how are seeds sown? Like in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, they have these beautiful wooden seed drills which are fixed to the plow. And the farmer, usually two women, stand on either side of the plow, and then they hold this funnel-like structure, and then they drop the seeds. And as the plow runs, these women are seeding. So there's a these seed. So there are all these, and also that wooden seed drill is made locally using local wood and artisanship and craftsmanship. So there is just so much, so many cultural, ecological, historic, connections that we can build across chapters. That I always, laugh about this. That if you take food, you could just run every chapter in science with it, because there would be chemistry concepts, physics concepts, biology concepts, all of that. Yeah. So yeah, so these are some of the sort of connections, and festivals around seeds, all of that. So many ways that we can build connections. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, extending this discussion further, so the main aim of this exercise was to make sense of the concept of biodiversity. So, this concept is introduced in grade 6 in the chapter Diversity in the Living World in the NCERT science textbook. So in the chapter, students did it through an exploration of the plants and animals in their immediate neighborhood. It reappears in grade 8 with the chapter on conservation of plants and animals. In this chapter, it is connected to wildlife, forest, and sacred groves. So the exercise that has been done is about the local food systems. So in what ways can an exploration of these local food systems add to this understanding?
Hmm, that's a good one. So, see, one of the things, when we talk about diversity, and specifically in this context, biodiversity, in a formal definition, there is an understanding of interrelationships, like relationships between the living beings in that space. So now, when one is, of course, for children to relate to it at a personal level, right, and at the level of their own location, at their own place, it's very important for them to see this. Now, they don't see many of these animals in their what they read in their textbooks. They don't see it in their own environment, right? So then the question is, what are other ways of looking at it, right? You look at the animals and plants in your own environment, right? Now, this is a farming community and it's a pastoral community. So there are very, very specific animal and plant systems in that which form part of their ecosystem, right? So what happens here is what you're doing here really is you're getting students to look at you're actually building skills of observation, right? Because
Yeah.
through this exercise of collecting information and collecting seeds, collecting information about food and cultivation practices, what we found was children actually began to observe. And when I say observe, it is through the conversations that they began to make sense of some of the things they did. They began to see interrelationships between the seeds they were growing and the cultivation practices. Why, for instance, when they were listening to their parents and grandparents, the kind of connections that they were able to establish for them. Why do we do multi-cropping, for instance? Why do we do intercropping, for instance? Why do we use certain kinds of fences? What does it do? How does it protect how does it protect the plants, the crops that we grow? So when you begin to ask these kinds of questions, you suddenly begin to see a lot of relationships. Okay. Now these children are also growing up in a community where where sort of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers are also being used. Okay. And they're also
Yeah.
watching changes, and their elders are also pointing out some of these changes to them, right? They're also talking about how increasingly there are more infections that plants are getting in their area, for instance. Okay. So they're talking to them about monoculture versus how in the past the way the crops, the combination of crops that were grown, the multi-cropping and the intercropping that was done, actually prevented plants from getting diseases. Okay. So then the question is, okay, what is prevent? So what is happening in those practices? You know, and later we will come to it, but you begin to understand what is the role of insects, what is the role of, and then also when they're talking about practices like using soil conditioners, using manure, for instance, right? That you're building soil fertility. So then you begin to look at, okay, what is soil fertility, right? The presence of microorganisms, the presence of insects, the presence of worms, okay, which actually build soil fertility. So then you slowly begin to look at these relationships, and ideas of food web that was only a concept in your textbook come to life here, right?
Yeah.
And when you understand it, and at such a tactile level, when you understand it, like आपके ही मतलब location में आपको जब समझ आ जाता है ना, you're able to take that understanding to the larger concept. It's like you abstract from it, no? I mean, when for any other, so when you do an activity and you learn a concept through that
Yeah.
activity, learn it by your own experience, then you begin to connect it to, and as you go to higher levels of classes, like when you go to grade 7, you go grade 8 to 9, 10, 11, 12, etc., then this understanding you can bring to the more complicated layers that come with understanding biodiversity at a later stage. So this was so it's really a way, because food systems are so embedded in that ecosystem, no, in that local ecology, in that local geography, in that soil. Food systems are so embedded in it. It is such a beautiful way, we thought, of understanding biodiversity. So yeah,
You spoke, you spoke of skills such as observation and the ability to draw connections between multiple entities. So,
yeah,
seeing this biodiversity as more than a scientific concept, what's the other knowledge and skills
yeah.
that students might be equipped with? So, to respond to the changes to their environment in the future.
Yeah. So the thing is, why do we? Okay, so for instance, say something like biodiversity. Why do we even study it, right? And in grade 8, for instance, there is this. They talk about biodiversity in the context of conservation.
Yeah.
So what does conservation actually mean? How do I relate to it at the level of an individual, right? So first I establish a relationship with my place. I begin to care about the environment that I live in. I begin to understand my place in that environment, right? And then so it's not just a term or a definition in your textbook. So now, after having worked on this project, you are slowly beginning as a student. Say, if I'm the student, I'm slowly beginning to understand some of these relationships, and then I have already built a relationship with the place that I'm in because I live here. I know the plant life here. I know the animal life here. I have a relationship with it, and also these are children who actually participate in the farming, in the pastoralism. They take goat and sheep for grazing on Sundays when they have, when they don't have school. So they have a lived experience. But how do you turn this into, how do you relate this then to this act of conservation, right?
Yeah.
Conservation cannot just be a concept or an approach. It can't just be a technique, right? First, you have to be able to relate. You have to be able to care. You have to be able to do that. Okay. So through an understanding of this local food system, and then therefore you begin to understand the concept of biodiversity, and you have lived this, and now you're able to relate to it at a different level. Okay, so then you say, okay, I know these seeds can grow in drought prone areas. Okay, I know these are hardy animals, say for example the Hallikar breed, that is a local breed of cattle there, or the goat and sheep, which are extremely hardy. These can survive, and goat particularly can survive in very, very marginalized and drought prone conditions, ecologically fragile areas as well. So when you begin to know this information, right, when you know this, then you have an understanding of what can survive under what conditions, right? So you have these seeds which are able to do extremely well, which are able to grow very well, which are able to survive in poor soils, in water deficient soils. So then when you see change in the environment, right, when you begin to see, for example, climate change is a reality for many of these communities.
Yeah.
It is very much a reality. Then they are so much better equipped because they have this knowledge of what grows, when, how, under what conditions, right? They know this. They also
Yeah.
have the seeds for it,
Correct.
right? So conservation becomes very, I'm going to repeat using the word, becomes very real and tactile, right? Then and then because you've talked to your grandparents and parents, they have also shared with you what the condition was when they were young,
Yeah.
what food they ate, how the soils were when they were young, how agriculture has changed over here in this particular location that we were in Andhra Pradesh. So when you know this, and you also are seeing that in some of the cases, the soil is becoming very infertile and poor.
Correct.
Many of the crops are actually succumbing to, say, for instance, tomato harvests get wiped out over there because of a fungal infection and a viral infection, right? and then you begin to your observation becomes sharper because you've already done some of that work through this project.
Correct.
So your awareness, your understanding, your sensitivity to the environment, you build a certain kind of you build a certain relationship which builds care, but at the same time you understand the science as well, what is in your textbook, right? This term biodiversity becomes very real. So it's a bit of a convoluted answer, but I don't know whether it sort of responded to, yeah, to what you were asking. Yeah.
So, one of the most remarkable aspects of this article is the way you facilitate the discussion around local biodiversity, the seeds, the information the students bring to school. These become an entry point to explore the hardiness of millets, resistance to pests, differences in soil, rainfall, and microclimates, foul breeds, insects and birds, and visitors to the fields, pathogens and weeds. No, for those teachers who would like to try this, can you share some guidance on how teachers can use these discussions to invite students to share and make a sense of their own observations of the world?
Yeah. So, as a teacher and having actually been with some of the teachers there and taught in this environment, when we are collecting, when you're doing a project like this and it requires gathering actually a lot of knowledge that exists within the community, right? So I want to relate this also to one of our earlier questions when you were asking about, what guidance did you give the students on how to collect information, right? See, one of the things that we were also trying to do through this whole exercise is to also build in children an understanding of the scientific process, right? And one of them, I mean, and particularly skills such as, how do you actually systematically collect information? How do you record it, right? And then using that information, how do you draw inferences from it, right? How do you make sense of the information that you collected? And also at the same time discover new information that you may have got. Although all these children have, this is their lived experience, if they are asked to listen very carefully to what their elders are telling them and to write, when they listen very carefully, they discover new information in their own locations, right? Okay, they knew how to take care of the cattle. They know how to till the soil, right? But when they're listening more carefully, then they also hear from their parents or grandparents what tilling the soil meant earlier when you had only draft animals. Okay, what was this idea of weeding? Information like that you begin to discover some new information, right? So as a teacher, there is a balance here, right? One thing is when you invite children to go out and collect this kind of information, you give them broad guidelines because they need to understand what is the intent of this project, right? We need to keep that core, right? Because we want to understand, yes, there is an exhibition, but we're also using this process to understand what is this concept of biodiversity and how can students connect it to their real worlds so that how can they actually understand what biodiversity is, right? So that is our main goal. I mean, that is the real intent. So one of the things I would say is definitely provide broad instructions to students to collect information like we did, right? Talk to parents, talk to grandparents, talk to parents, talk to others in your community. At the same time, suggest to them how they should collect the information. Now, once the information comes back, is also challenging because you get lots of information.
Yeah.
Now, how do you sift through that, and what kind of questions do you pick in order to be able to draw these threads of understanding from there? Because end of the day, we want to relate it to biodiversity. The danger here is there is so much information. There's information about pollination that suddenly comes out from this conversation. There's all kinds of information that comes out. but you have to keep coming back to the same. So I would say, pick a few very specific questions. So you look at the information that has come to you, right? And
Yeah.
then you begin to then say, okay, fine. Let's ask a few questions here. Why are certain kinds of crops? You look at everybody's information and say, okay, here's a pattern that we're observing. That some of the crops that are growing in the hilly areas, so certain kinds of millets or certain kinds of gourds or certain kinds of um, vegetables or are different in the hilly areas compared to the plains. Why is that? Right? So then you begin to think about, okay, so is there a difference? So then you begin to ask leading questions about the microclimate there, right? Is there a difference in the rainfall? Is there a difference in the soil quality? Is there a difference in the way farming is done? Right? So, for instance, through when these questions were asked about why is there a difference, one of the things that the students came up with is that those of us who live in the plains are closer to the market. So in our farms, we actually grow more crops that are needed in the market. So we use water differently. Groundwater levels are different. We also grow wetland paddy. Okay. Whereas in the hilly areas, they grow dryland and upland paddy, which requires much less water. So it's not just the
Yeah.
inherent soil quality, the rainfall availability, but it's also how resources are used differently in different places. How is the groundwater used in the plains versus how is it used in the hilly areas? Okay, so you ask these kinds of questions. So that's one example of a question. Now another example of another kind of question could be, for instance, when children talked about the different kinds of practices that they came up with, right? So you could ask, right? Okay, now you're not. So one of the things is that there's no weeding done, right? In traditional systems of agriculture here, there's no weeding done, but instead, what the women do is in between the crops, you have lots of uncultivated greens that come there. Okay, it comes with the cow dung, with the manure, because the cattle graze all over the hills and they come back having grazed actually possibly some medicinal plants and other herbs as well. So all that also starts growing in between because it's sprouting from the manure. So women collect those weeds. But in the plains, in some of the farms, uh, labor is hired for de-weeding because you're growing commercial crops. For instance, you're growing tomatoes for the market, right? So there are different practices here itself, right? So then you can start asking those kind of questions. So for instance, we talk about weeds here. Their parents do de-weeding down here, but up in the hills, de-weeding is not done. Instead, you are collecting greens for various purposes, either for consumption or to make to make medicines, using it for different. So you begin to look at the information and ask some leading questions to children. So one is of course about the microclimate and the soil conditions. The other is also about practices. Okay, and then you're essentially looking at the information that has arrived and seeing what kind of questions can you ask from and get the children to think about it a little further.
Yeah.
And the children themselves have asked a lot of questions as well. So for instance, when they look at their own day, when they're looking at the differences in information collected, they're also wondering why there is this difference. Why are my friends from say Morsina in Palli, which is a village above, why are they growing different things compared to Mandamar Palli, which is down below, right? Why are these seeds different? So that kind of, yeah. So then as teachers, you begin to ask questions about trying to get them to build interrelationships and getting some familiarity about ecosystems, and then the students themselves ask out of curiosity, and then that's how the whole thing then builds up. Yeah.
So as you said, the kind of information that you get, the volume of information, many
Yes.
important threads emerge from this during this
Yes.
discussion. So
Yes.
if you were to pick one or two, the first one is about adaptation. How do some species of millets, gourds, vegetables, pulses this drought-resistant ruminants and fowl breeds. How do they thrive in this hot and dry, semi-arid landscape? Can you please elaborate on this? You
Yeah.
spoke about it a bit, but could you please elaborate on this?
Yeah. You know, the reason I was smiling is because it's quite amazing to see how these plants survive and adapt. So one of the things that and I learned a lot in the process because having gone to this environment at a much later point in life, you realize how little you actually observe. So, for instance, if you look at millets, of course, we talked about them being rain fed by their inherent property quality. Gourds can adapt to very dry, marginalized soils and to very dry soil conditions because of its, I mean, gourds. Okay, let's look at Lauki, for instance, or you look at ridge gourd, or you look at Karela, bitter gourd. You look at say ivy gourd. All of these, the skin is quite waxy. So that's an adaptation to
Okay.
be able to survive under this condition. And so similarly, one thing that I wanted to say here also is that one adaptation is through the leaves, through the skin of the fruit itself, which would, in this case, we were taking the example of Loki. One is also often, I mean, I just want to give one example here that we had sown some millet seeds and in anticipation of rain because there's a certain pattern of rainfall there. But that year we didn't get rain at that point. Okay, the rain came much later, so the seeds were sown in the soil without any water because no water was available. And 4 months later, the rain was 4 months late. When the rain came, the seeds sprouted. So it's very interesting to see what kind of adaptation the millet seeds. You think of you think of spores and microorganisms. They tide over, when they are when the necessary nutrition is not available, right? So this is one of those an example of adaptation of these whether it's millets or goats or vegetables. But similarly, the animals, the Halikar breed of cattle, the fowl there, right? Mostly it is hen that mostly it's poultry that is backyard poultry that is there. There is a local strain of backyard poultry here, okay, which is resistant to the Ranikhet viral disease. So, so they don't get the Ranikhet disease, okay. So when local vets understood this became a very prized species, this particular local breed of fowl, so they're and also I would say, I think one other point to add here is even the cultivation practices, the traditional cultivation practices also allowed for pest, what we call pest resistance, right? Because the way you are cultivating, when you do intercropping and multicropping, the choice of crops, right? And the other plants that you plant, say neem, guava. Okay, so guava leaves have pesticidal properties. Neem, we all know, pesticides are made from neem, right? And so local practices of developing soil conditioners, sort of, I don't want to call them pesticides, but soil rejuvenators, you could call them, right? Which builds soil health, right? That also allows for a certain level of pest resistance to happen in these. So one is and here I was just thinking, in textbooks, often when we look at adaptations, and I was looking at the grade 6 textbook, there is an example of rhododendrons, okay, in Sikkim versus in the Nilgiris, okay. There's a beautiful photograph, okay, and it's rhododendrons, but they are very different because of the wind in the Nilgiris versus in Sikkim, the size of the plant, the size of the leaves. So, when you read that as a child, for me, I'm just thinking, oh, lovely, how nice, but what does it mean in my location, right? So then now you begin to then understand that how can these crops or these animals survive in this kind of marginalized and ecologically fragile, in a sense, area. Then you begin to look at how have they adapted to this landscape, how have they, what features do they have that allow them to survive and thrive also to some extent in these landscapes. Yeah.
So while you were speaking about this, I recall an earlier conversation about soil. Is how soil, how a crucial role soil microorganisms play in supporting local biodiversity. So for
Yeah.
those teachers, you can find out more about their role and ways to explore this in your classroom in Radha's earlier article and webinar titled Getting to the Soul of the Soil. And the links are available in the chat box. Coming back, no, you say that these traditional practices were developed based on the knowledge the community built over generations of sustained observation and learning from experimentation. Now, this sounds very familiar to how scientific knowledge evolves. How do you say this?
Yeah. So when I hear, there's one thing that I wanted to sort of talk about a little bit. See, yes, it's built on sustained observation, it's built on experimentation, but a lot of this, which is also similar to how scientific knowledge is built, but a lot of this information is in people's heads and it is in practice, right? It's passed on from generation to generation. And if you practice it, then you are able to take it to the next generation. And a lot of this is built on observation and it's built on very keen observation as well. But it's not documented. Okay. So one of the things that this exercise, that this project did, was to actually help in documenting a lot of this information. It was also the larger project that some of us were working with the community on. So why was it important to document it? Because then you're also able to capture reasons for why people did something. There was an observation. They noticed something. Say, for instance, a farmer, because when you see farmers, particularly those who practice, traditional systems of farming, you will find them very quietly observing, and you're wondering what they are doing. They're actually looking at the features of the plant. Okay, they're looking at which plant is the healthiest, which one, what are the grains like, what is the leaf like, are there any indications of pest attack, are there any indications of any kind of weakness in the plant. Okay, so they're looking at morphological characteristics, but when it's not documented, what happens is this knowledge gets lost. And this is very, very important knowledge for us going forward, as we talked earlier. An understanding of what seeds can survive under what conditions, what practices allow for us to have agriculture that will sustain us, as opposed to agriculture that will destroy soil fertility. Right? This is very, very important knowledge for the
Correct.
future. So how do we actually so if we're looking at it from the process of science, it's so important to document, because when you document, then you can, even somebody new who wants to try it can replicate it, can try
Correct.
it and see what happens in their condition, and the detail of documentation, right? Because these people, I mean, the particularly the elders in the community, when the children were talking to them, or even when I have talked to them, the kind of detail they hold in their heads. And memory is a very strange thing, because you can sometimes you can sometimes remember it differently from reality. You can, because you tend to, like, for instance, some of the children came back and told us, oh, we heard that there was lots more rain earlier and there is much less rain now. So we said, okay, let's look at historic rainfall records. Okay, is it true or is it not true, right? And then we looked at historic rainfall records, and the average rainfall in that area is 550 to 600 mm. And that's what it was even now, except that the pattern has shifted,
Yeah.
the periodicity has shifted, the months in which the rainfall happens has shifted. Those kinds of things have shifted. So this documentation. So although although the observation, the learning from experimentation, all that holds, but I think what is important is the documentation of it, and as a result, what has also happened is it's in this community itself. I give you an example of people having lost some seeds. And
Mm-hmm.
we actually discovered one during this process itself, where because the person who was holding that information was not around. Okay, this seed has been saved. It was never
Okay.
used after that. It was never cultivated, so nobody knew how to cultivate it. And it was a variety of kodo millet that is extremely drought resistant.
Okay.
Okay, so then when it was brought out and then shared with another elder, and then the elder said, "Oh yeah, this was grown when I was a child, and I vaguely remember this is how we used to grow it." So then a young farmer actually experimented with it, and then was after 3 or 4 rounds of experimentation, he was able to actually cultivate. I mean, he was able to get a good yield. Okay, so then he actually sat down and documented what he did. What was the soil like, what was the soil condition that was required, when was the watering required, or if because it was rain fed. Then the question was, what happens when you don't have rain at the right time? How do you then ensure that it sprouts? So all of that, and also things like, how do they do germination tests? How do they look at viability of the how do they look at the viability of the seeds, right? So there is a festival that is celebrated, but slowly that festival is fading away because only 2 or 3 villages were, at the moment actually practice this festival called Molakal Ponami, where they sow the seeds 15 days, before the full moon, and then on the full moon there is a celebration, and you identify which batch of seeds sprouted, and so then you know that it's viable. So how do you so when you start documenting all of this, that there were these practices of how viability testing was done, etc. In that sense, I think, yeah, this is how I look at it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. It's quite interesting. I mean, the details and the nuances and everything, how to keep track of it, and it's actually quite detailed and interesting. The collaboration is the key to this pedagogical approach presented in this article. Collaborations between the students and teachers in making decisions on to what to include as exhibits, and between children, their families, and others in the local community in creating the exhibits. You share how this intergenerational learning can help students build an appreciation of the knowledge that resides in their communities and confidence in being active participants in their own learning. Could you please elaborate on this?
Yeah. So actually, when I hear one of the things, and I think, particularly like you work with the schools, and you work with them for a while, as have many other teachers who work in schools in communities. You build a certain relationship with them. So in our case, I think the relationship that we had built with the community, both through the work with the farmers and with the school, with the Zilla Parishad High School. As a result of that, some of these suggestions and some of the approaches that were suggested were taken up quite readily, and there was a certain sense of trust that, that this is actually going, that this approach we are willing to try, because we think it'll work, and we think that this will be a good way to get students to relate to biodiversity, to the concept of biodiversity. But intergenerational learning, so that's a very powerful method of learning, because what happens is that it's and I think of this, and we should probably point our audience also to some of the work that has been done in Marudam School. And in the past, we had a webinar with the Marudam School, and maybe we'll share it at some other point. But where we're looking at, how one looks at knowledge, right? That there are multiple ways by which there are multiple ways in which we know the world. You see, one way is, of course, through science. Science is one frame, it's one way of knowing the world.
Yeah.
But another way of knowing the world is through lived experience, right? So how do we know the best about our world from both of these, right? We're not it's not about pitting one against the other, no. It's about so when we talk about intergenerational learning, see, often what happens is when students go to school and come back, right, and many of the elders in this community have never had formal
Yeah.
schooling. So they look at the books and what children learn in school as very powerful, as that is real knowledge, because they're studying science or because they're studying in a school, right? And children also, I mean, we've had situations where we've had
Yeah.
conversations with children in the community where many of the children feel very alienated from, they almost feel embarrassed to share that they take their goat and sheep grazing. Because in the school, there are children who come from families which are not pastoralists and which are not small and marginal farmers. Okay, they are the larger landholding farmers. So there, the children may not contribute to, may not actually be engaged directly in the farming work. Right? So this knowledge so then what happens is you feel there is a certain privileging and legitimization of knowledge that you learn in school versus the knowledge that comes from experience, from lived experience, from years of practice, experimentation, observation that exists within this community, which has enormous value for the future.
Correct.
Okay, so then once I mean, the hope is, of course, that through projects like this, where the lived experience is used to get children to relate what they're studying in the classroom to their real world. That these are not, that there's nothing alien about this. That learning happens from multiple sources, and in the end, we are that much richer about how we know the world around us, right? And at the same time, for the elders in the community as well, there's a sense of knowing that, because during the exhibition and even after the exhibition, some of the children's grandparents were very moved, that the knowledge that they had, that they thought was only, it's just farming, it's just knowing about the land, it's just knowing about the soil,
Yeah.
uh, to see that there's science in it, there is a certain, so in that sense, and it also gives children confidence because it is their own knowledge, it has come from their own experience. They don't have to memorize something from a book, right? So that alienation
Yeah.
from your own life, and in the larger context of learning and education, when we think
Yes.
about it, it's, yeah, yeah, yeah,
So, I mean, in connection to this, we have a question from our audience.
yeah.
Preeti Singh asks, what are the main components one should consider when we are documenting this process of farming?
Okay, when your main questions that one should consider when documenting the process of farming. Okay,
Yeah,
so
main components.
yeah. So what I would say is, don't look at it as components. Start as a cycle. Okay, start. What is the first point of starting? The seed. So food has a life cycle, right? And one way of looking at it is going from the field to your fingers, literally. You'll read about farm to fork, but the way I like to say it is from the field to your fingers. Go through that entire cycle, Preeti. Start from the seed. What kind of seeds? Where are the seeds coming from? Okay, start from there. And if the community is saving seeds, how are they saving seeds? Or if they're buying from the market, what seeds are they buying from the market, right? And then you go from how is it sown, what time of the year, what is grown, seasonality of the food that is grown, right? And then you go from there to taking care of the food crops, right? What kind of care is taken? How are, for instance, what practices are done? How is it actually grown? Is it multi-cropping, rotational cropping? Is it, if it's a commercial farm, if it's a farm that has been deeply influenced by Green Revolution, then what practices? How much water is used? Is this a water-intensive crop? What is the source of water, right? And how frequently it's watered, etc. Fertilization of soils. Are pesticides used? If pesticides are not used, how are plants protected from what is normally considered as pests, right?
Yeah.
So you actually go through that whole cycle, and then you look at harvesting, and then from harvesting you look at some of these places particularly, and before we go to harvesting, sorry, I just want to come back a little bit. What are the technologies that are used? How is seed sown? How is the land prepared for cultivation, right? What about during the when the crop is, when there's a standing crop there, right? So all of that. So you actually go from seed to your fingers till it comes to your plate. So I would say, um, look at it as a cycle as opposed to a process. In a sense, yeah. That. Preeti, I hope that answers your question to some extent.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we had time for only for one question. So
Yeah,
thank you, Radha, and
not
for
at all.
everyone who has joined us today.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for sharing those wonderful experiences. If you have any questions for Radha that did not get addressed today, please send them to us at iwonder@apu.edu.in. We will do our best to get them answered. Join us again for our next webinar on December 11th, 2024 at 4:30 p.m. For all those who have not subscribed to iWonder yet, we hope you will do so now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Yeah. Thanks, Vinay.
Thank you.